Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. You are listening to the voice of Evan Buck, and because I'm doing intro duties, I will also obligatorily throw in my intro for myself. Hey, everyone. How's it going? It's your boy, Evan. With that out of the way, I will also introduce in no specific order or particular order the other two gentlemen that serve as co-hosts with me. To my immediate right is Chris Coppola.
Hi, good people.
Not leaving us too long to wait for his signature greeting. And we also have to his right on my Zoom screen, Kai McAllister.
Hey, good to be back.
All right. So with our introductions out of the way, we are looking today at a very interesting, very specific point in time in the early 1890s. And I'm going to throw the ball over to Kai to kind of kick this can down the road a little bit to mix as many metaphors as I possibly can. Because this was his suggested fork, and I think he has a lot of historical knowledge on it. So Kai, how about you take it from here and inform the audience of what we're going to be looking at today?
Yes, absolutely. So today, in celebration of Labor Day, we are going to be discussing a very important period of time in the creation of history. Indeed, the creation of Labor Day itself. And we're going to be talking about the Pullman Strike of 1894, otherwise known as the Railroad Rebellion, the Union Strike or the Railroad Union Strike, which ultimately led to the creation of Labor Day, which was signed into law by President Grover Cleveland. So to give you some background on what happened, and then I'll introduce the fork. The Pullman Strike of 1894 was a major railroad strike that led directly to Congress establishing Labor Day as a federal holiday. As I said, it was signed into law by President Grover Cleveland on June 28th, 1894. And just to give you some background on the strike, what basically ended up happening was there was a railroad company, or railroad car company that was made by George Pullman, and it was a really interesting railroad company. It was one of the first railroad companies that actually popularized a so-called luxurious railroad experience. In the pre-discussion, I was talking with Evan and Chris, and I kind of compared a railroad travel pre-Pullman to what air travel in economy class is today. It was exhausting. It was uncomfortable. It was kind of sardine packing. Pullman comes along and basically offers this luxury experience with these amazing, waiters called, I'm forgetting what they were called, but they had a really cool name. Pullman porters. Thank you. They were Pullman porters. They had beautiful carriages that were ornately decorated. It was a really good experience. However, as a result of some poor business performances and the economy writ large, the Pullman company actually ended up suffering some financial losses. And as a result, George Pullman decided to basically cut wages. But in so doing, he did not commensurately lower the rent in the quarters that his workers were housed at. So basically, he built a whole city called Pullman. His workers lived in those houses, and they paid rent to him. He makes
Henry Ford was not the first one to create this whole idea of the corporate city, by the way. It's just he was the guy who mainly popularized it. So this predates Henry Ford.
Yeah, indeed. And to add on to that, the subsequent demise of Pullman ended up being the harbinger of death for all of those corporate towns. The city of Chicago basically said, we're taking this over, and that kind of led to the end of that. But that's a rabbit hole.
In Chicago, if you look in Appalachia and the American South, you had mine towns where, lo and behold, one name kind of tends to dominate things because that's the mill name.
Yes,
Yep.
most definitely. In any case, he ends up lowering their wages by about 30%, I think it was. And he does not lower the rent in the quarters that he is renting to his workers. This ends up precipitating a strike. They want their wages to be restored, or they want their rents cut. George Pullman is ferocious in saying he is not going to negotiate with them. And as a result, the strike ends up escalating. It becomes a nationwide strike. Everyone is supporting them. And
so to kind of get involved a little bit here.
Yes, go ahead, Chris.
The people that are involved initially in this labor action, in this strike, are the production workers actually making Pullman cars.
Correct.
In Pullman, Illinois. The group that gets involved, and I'll let you get into more of them, they get involved. They have a strike of all workers on all railroads. That's how it extends out to kind of a network-wide issue.
Yeah, it's the largest solidarity strike in the nation's history. One of the largest solidarity strikes in the nation's history. They basically said, we're going to support you guys. Sorry, Chris.
It's the largest because now it's illegal.
There you go. So it was a wonderful, large solidarity strike. Everything was going well. They basically agreed that they would not service any trains that had Pullman cars attached to them. So that meant that Pullman basically was out of operation for a long time. They were not able to do business because no one would service their cars. However, they were clever. And what they decided to do was to attach Pullman cars to Postal Service cars. In so doing, when a Pullman car would pull in attached to a Postal Service car, the workers, in adherence to their strike, would not service the Pullman car, but at the same time, as an inadvertent consequence, they would also not service the Postal Service car.
But let's not forget, Pullman was a personal friend of the president, Grover Cleveland. He knew that Cleveland, as a classical liberal bourbon Democrat, doesn't believe that the government should fundamentally do a whole heck of a lot. But one of the basic things that is spelled out in the Constitution that the government must do is make sure that the mail is delivered on time. So Pullman knows this is part of Pullman's brilliance. He knows exactly what his friend in the Oval Office is going to want to do and how he's going to get involved, and pulls that trigger. So anyway,
correct.
Continue.
Yeah. And as a result, that ends up, when you disrupt the Postal Service like that, that amounts to disruption of interstate commerce. That then, as Evan says, requires the U.S. federal government to get involved, which they do. They send federal troops to go and disrupt the strike. People end up getting killed. Violence roars up, and then they ended up destroying some cars. There's just a whole bunch of violence and mayhem. And as a result, Grover Cleveland ends up arresting a bunch of the leaders of this strike. They're thrown in jail. The whole strike kind of dissipates in a massive, massive defeat for the labor unions.
And let's also throw in here as well.
An ephemeral defeat, but a defeat nonetheless.
Yes.
Go ahead, Evan.
And also something to throw in here as well to understand is a name that's going to come up, I think, a few times during this podcast is Eugene V. Debs. Mm-hmm. He was the head of the ARU union at the time, American Railroads Union, or what's the acronym? American Railway Union. He's the president at the time of this union. He was supportive of the plight of the workers and the strike, and he was communicating through Telegram pretty furiously the entire time. Don't cause violence. Don't cause trouble. Troops are on the way. We can't cause more problems. We just need to keep this focused on what our cause is about. An injunction was issued, which prevented Debs from even being able to send these telegrams to begin with, to basically tell his workers to not riot and to, not cause problems. So that was one of the big issues and it's kind of interesting when you look at it in retrospect. Cleveland basically arrested Debs and some of the other leaders, supposedly for causing violence, when the injunction actually prevented him from being able to do the one thing he could do to stop the violence. Mm-hmm. So that's just something that we want to keep in mind as well in terms of, the potential trajectory of Debs' career. But
yeah, Debs is arrested, as Evan noted. A whole bunch of other leaders are arrested. That strike in that particular capsule of time is a major defeat for organized labor. The strike dissipates. A lot of public sentiment turns against them because they're apparently violent and they're disrupting commerce and all of that stuff. In our timeline, though, Grover Cleveland, sort of as a conciliatory gesture, ends up getting Congress to pass, and then he signs into law Labor Day. What we know as Labor Day and what we still celebrate today as Labor Day. And that was sort of his concession to organized labor. Hey, we arrested you, we destroyed you, we did everything we could to suppress you, but we will give you this holiday as a way to assuage your discontent, sort of a middle ground road. We're not going to concede any economic concessions, but we are going to give you a holiday that you can celebrate to kind of recognize you and thank you. And that's kind of the end of it. And then we go on and, the labor movement continues and we get more concessions up and up to this day. Our proposed fork is, what if Grover Cleveland had not signed into law Labor Day? What if he had adopted the same disposition that his friend, George Pullman, had, which was do not concede, do not give way, hold your ground, and fight the good fight. That was the disposition of George Pullman. He did not want to go to the table with his workers. He just wanted to dictate from the top and say, this is the way it is. You deal with it. If Grover Cleveland, who, as Evan mentioned, was one of those people who was very pro-business and very much a bourbon Democrat, very much hands-off in terms of federal overreach, what if he had adopted that disposition and said, listen, these workers are voluntarily employing themselves with George Pullman. They are the ones, they can, if they don't like it, they can leave sort of attitude. And he says, you guys can quit and we're not going to make any concessions to you. And he doesn't pass on Labor Day. How does that affect the body politic of organized labor going forward? That's the fork that we're proposing, and I'll leave it to the crew and myself to chew on it further.
Yeah. So something that I think because sometimes I kind of wish that our audience can see a little bit of the deliberations, both on our Slack channel and in the pre-podcast, because Kai and I had basically a decently well-spirited debate on our Slack channel about the actual impacts of this specific fork. And really, I think this is what most of the rest, if not all the rest of this episode is going to be about, is, to what extent do we think that the creation, or in the alternate timeline, the lack of creation of a formalized federal Labor Day, how that is going to impact the labor movement and American politics moving forward. Because I will note on more of the, I guess you can call it the less impactful camp, that, there are some things to consider. For example, Grover Cleveland did not create Labor Day. Labor Day was actually conceived of as an idea somewhere in the early 1800s, 1882, 1884, somewhere around there. 23 states already had, by the time that Cleveland made it federal holiday, had some, Labor Day celebrations, passed some sort of Labor Day law, celebrated Labor Day. Labor Day itself was largely seen as a mechanism by which we can, and by we, I mean the American government, and the broader ruling class, can kind of neuter more of these more radical socialist / communist elements in the labor movement, who their holiday of choice was May 1st, May Day. And so Labor Day was kind of seen as a way for the broader, labor class collective consciousness, that to be elevated, but more on a more moderate level. So we already had this going on. And Cleveland himself, when we look at our timeline, we've tossed out the phrase bourbon Democrat a lot, giving a little bit of just tiny background on that. When we think of the modern Republican Democratic parties, we think of left versus right, those sorts of things. Back in this time period, things were a little bit more muddied, a little bit more muddled. It wasn't quite as clean of a left-right division. And I was saying in the pre-podcast that Grover Cleveland would probably be seen as a liberal, Northeast Republican in modern American political parlance. He was for the use of force to enforce anti-labor union strikes, that interfered with federal and interstate commerce, federal functions and interstate commerce. But he was also pretty, and anti-corruption, but pretty big and pro-business in some other ways as well. So the name Bourbon Democrat actually comes from I believe it was the anti-Napoleon government in France that
the family name of the old ruling family that was overthrown by the revolution.
Yeah.
Yes. Later, Napoleon
and then later came back after Napoleon, right? And so that's where we get the name. So
the idea being this: they are the restored power. You kind of had a revolution, and after the revolution ran its course, the old powers came back in. This is very much what happened in the American South. And this is what Grover Cleveland represents. You had the Civil War, you had Reconstruction. Reconstruction is over, the old powers come back in, exactly like the Bourbons did, basically like 50 years before this.
Yeah, exactly. So I think ultimately it's not the creation or the lack thereof of Labor Day itself that may necessarily produce massive changes, because let's be real here. Cleveland, I don't think personally believed in this. This was an act of political expediency more than anything. It wasn't moral conviction on his part. He was just simply wanting to not be seen as totally anti-labor, but he also didn't want to give anything to the more hardcore elements of the labor movement. So he's like, okay, I'll toss you a bone. I'll give you this. So I think and I think this will maybe set the tone for the rest of the episode and a little bit of back and forth discussion too, if there's disagreement on this. But I personally don't think it's the creation of Labor Day itself that adds fuel to the fire or really changes massive things. Cleveland isn't really remembered for this. He's it's kind of like just a historical footnote. We celebrate Labor Day as Americans. It's kind of the end of summer. Culturally, this probably has some impact that we can get into later. But, do we even remember who actually created Labor Day in terms of the broader American consciousness? No, the only people who remember that are the three people who are talking right now and the listeners of this podcast. Nobody remembers Grover Cleveland for doing this. So I don't think it's necessarily that really changes things a ton. I think it's really just more so that this would be an indicator of the times, and this would be an indicator of the attitudes of the ruling class at that point, and that may change small things down the line that end up having big impacts. Do you two think that that's probably a good summary of where we see this going?
Why don't you take on and talk about Eugene Debs and what this does to his career?
Yeah, let's actually talk about that, because I think that's one of the biggest immediate impacts. So Eugene Debs, if that's a name that you've heard before, it's either because you're one of us, kind of history nerds, or you might have heard Bernie Sanders talk about him in a speech at some point, one time or another. Debs is kind of a, brainchild of, really has a lot of inspiration for what we would see today as, the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, those kinds of politicians. Outside of those circles, though, you might not have heard of him or know who he is. So Eugene Debs, who I referenced earlier, was the head of the American Railway Union that was responsible for the Pullman strike. He was put in jail, and he was the subject of the Supreme Court case in regarding Debs that reinforced the government's ability to use force to quash union protests of this nature. Hence why what Chris said, this was the biggest, sort of strike of this kind, because after that case, it's illegal in all intents and purposes.
Sympathy strikes not to get too into it, they become illegal in 1947 under the Taft-Hartley Act.
Yes, exactly. So Debs, he gets arrested, he is dealt a setback, a defeat here, but this really while he's in jail for this, this is what makes him change from becoming just a labor agitator to a full-blown socialist. And he ends up running for president under a newly established third political party, the Socialist Party USA. So he ran in 1904. He got his best showing in 1912, where he got 6% of the vote. As a side note, the first time I read the name Eugene Debs was when I was probably like a 10 or 11-year-old kid flipping through a book about presidents and presidential election history, and seeing, oh, who is this Eugene Debs guy who got 6% of the vote in 1912? That's a little bit of a deep cut there for how I learned about who he was. So he ran a few times for president. He also ran in 1920 when he actually conducted his campaign from a jail cell, which I think is interesting too. He was in jail again, and he got 3.4% of the vote there.
So he got out. He got out after the jailing because of the Pullman strike, and they put him back in 1918.
I think, wasn't that because of his anti-war activism?
Basically, they said that encouraging young men not to register for the World War I draft was sedition.
Mm-hmm.
He was arrested because of it. He was put in jail because of it. And I think that's important to kind of talk about and think about where he goes on his kind of personal journey of he's gone from being a labor agitator to being much more political in terms of, you know what, we shouldn't be involved in wars. We shouldn't be, you know, he expands what he's paying attention to, basically, from kind of a more focused labor worker management relationship focus.
Yeah, exactly. So here, I'm just going to cut to the chase, and I'm going to say where I think Debs goes from this, because, you know, in our timeline, the Socialist Party itself is not very successful, but it's the, you know, third political parties are often indications of, you know, single issue parties or just this broader idea. If you have enough people vote for a third party, it shows that there's enough dissatisfaction with how the two main parties are running things to where one of the two parties that does get into power ultimately adopts some of their platform or takes some of those issues with them. That's where the Socialist Party kind of goes in our timeline, is a lot of their ideas that they proposed end up in some form or another becoming central to progressive party politics. And one could argue it had a big impact on what happened with the New Deal in the 30s and 40s. So I think in our timeline, if just by this little act, and, you know, I wish I kind of read some of, you know, Deb's letters from jail or whatever to kind of chronicle and see his mindset shift. I'm just taking a stab in the dark here. But I think that because Labor Day happens and is given a little bit of this bone, Debs, while he's sitting in jail, kind of has this epiphany. And he's like, you know what? Things aren't really going to necessarily change on an incremental level because the people in power are just going to keep giving us these small little things and aren't going to actually shift the needle far enough for workers' rights. I got to change from being a labor union guy to a socialist guy. I think if there's no Labor Day, it's very likely that Debs stays in the labor union camp for longer because there isn't a bone given. There isn't a little carrot on a stick given for the workers. And Debs reasons to himself, hey, I'm still needed as someone, maybe not as the leader, because let's be real, he's kind of neutered by what happens with the Pullman strike, but maybe he serves in some sort of advisory role or serves as some sort of continued organizer in the labor union camp. Initially, I thought this could radicalize him even more, but as I kind of thought about it and processed it, I think that this actually makes Debs, you know, maybe he takes some of his more socialist ideas, but rather than having it be part of a political party and political party program and platform, he advocates it for more on the union agitation side. But anyway, that's where I personally see his career developing. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think Eugene Debs' career definitely takes some interesting turns in terms of what happens if there's no concessions made as a result of Labor Day, without Labor Day. Another person that I think is interesting to think about is William Jennings Bryan. So for those unaware, the election of 1896, I keep on wanting to say Grover Cleveland is termed out, but at this point, he's not termed out. He just decides not to run for a third term.
Well, it's debate. He served 2 terms.
Yes.
And it's a completely tradition-based thing of, does the tradition mean 2 consecutive terms, or does the tradition mean just 2 terms?
Yeah.
But between this and the collapse of 1893, he kind of decides that I probably shouldn't be putting my name forward.
Well, what I mean by that is like there wasn't a term limit like there was after FDR. It was more of a convention thing, but he was like, so that's when I say termed out, that's what I'm referring to, but he's, not technically termed out. But anyways,
and I mean, Cleveland did already bust the idea of serving 2 consecutive terms because he served 2 non-consecutive terms. So he was more than welcome to try again and serve 2 consecutive terms.
It's kind of like thinking about, we talked a little bit about like the election of, let's say, 2008. If you are in the George W. Bush administration in 2008, you're almost glad you're termed out, because you strongly suspect you're going to be creamed if you run again.
Yep.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And so Grover Cleveland, he decides he's not going to run again. And so the Democrats have an opportunity to nominate somebody else. And the person who they end up nominating is William Jennings Bryan. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, he's from the same party, so therefore he's going to be, the heir apparent successor of Grover Cleveland. Not so. As a matter of fact, the Democratic Party was kind of not happy with Cleveland. And so they decide to go with William Jennings Bryan as a sort of repudiation against Cleveland. And as a result, William Jennings Bryan has a much more pro-labor disposition than his Republican opponent, William McKinley. And so in the election of 1896, and actually I think Evan brought up in the pre-discussion that William Jennings Bryan actually served in the Populist Party before becoming a Democrat. So that just kind of goes to show his pro-labor credentials.
In this term, and in actually in the election of 92 that put Cleveland in power, the Democrats and the Progressive Party, the People's Party, which ran a third candidate then, developed fusion tickets in certain areas where, and the best example is William Jennings Bryan in 1896. He's nominated by the Progressive Party and the Democratic Party. So he's running on 2 different tickets.
Right. And so, all of that to just furnish his credentials and show, he was more pro-labor than Grover Cleveland was. Grover Cleveland was very much not of that ilk, but William Jennings Bryan was. He was no Eugene Debs, but he was definitely more so of a Debs.
And I'll step in here as well and mention that the biggest difference between the Clevelands and the Bourbons and the Populists and the Bryans, I would not say is the labor issue, although that is an issue where there is a difference. I think the single biggest massive issue that differentiates the two is money supply. And the gold standard versus the silver standard, one of the most influential political speeches of all time, no matter like where you're at on the political spectrum, pretty much anybody can agree that William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech is one of the biggest single speeches in American political history, shifting the Overton window, immediately, of course, delivering him the Democratic nomination, which he had a decent chance of winning before the convention. But after that, it was like, no contest. It's over. The convention rioted for basically 25 minutes after the speech was over. And the police could not protect Bryan. Like, he was just carried up to the podium by the supporters. And he had to retire to his hotel for everything to calm down until he was able to actually be nominated. Like, that's how amazingly impactful this speech was in the immediate effect. That's in our timeline. I think in this alternate timeline, you have the issues that animate Bryan, which is mainly the issue of silver and the gold standard. I think there's a little bit more of an emphasis on trying to get what is traditionally McKinley's base of support. Kind of this Rust Belt, Midwestern industrialists and those kind of workers. I think Bryan And, to Brian's credit, he ran a very vigorous campaign in 1896 in stark contrast to McKinley's front porch campaign style. Um, but McKinley's campaign manager pioneered a lot of things that we still see in modern politics, but also Brian does as well. And Brian, for his effort, goes through all of the swing states, just barnstorms the country essentially, kind of like a modern equivalent you can see of a Democrat who did this, who was also not, successful in his efforts, was Beto O'Rourke in Texas, who he basically pulled a very William Jennings Bryan-esque campaign, which, although in defeat, still impacts a lot of how, political candidates do things now. So Brian does this. But I think in this alternate timeline, a lot of these elections, as we noted in the pre-podcast discussion, a lot of these elections hinge on, last minute October surprises or, minute issues or minute details that when we as amateur historians take a step back, we look at the issues that defined the campaign and we're like, oh yeah, that's why X and Y candidate won or lost. A lot of the time, not every time, but a lot of the time, it actually just comes down to a very idiosyncratic point that changes, or some sort of one small swing group of voters or another that ends up going for one side or the other over a very particular issue. And this is something that we touched upon in the pre-podcast, but now I think we have the point, we're at the point in time where we can fully explicate and expound on this. But I personally think that Brian stands a solid chance of, if not outright winning the election of 1896, I think he has a stronger showing at the very least, because I think he has a very ample ground and opportunity to, his campaign is basically defined by the big guy versus the little guy. That is Brian. That is his campaign.
To talk a little bit about your point of bimetallism and kind of explain how this works.
Yeah.
The United States at this point is on the gold standard. Every dollar is backed by a certain amount of gold in Fort Knox. Maybe not Fort Knox, but held in the U.S. Reserve. Bimetallism says we want to back our money with gold and silver. It's a lot more silver. This allows a lot more money. Who is that good for? People that owe money. Think about your Okies. Think about your farmers in the Midwest that have a mortgage on the farm. Think about, these railroad workers we just talked about who are trying to make rent. Who is that bad for? People that have money. So that's kind of what, the progressives at this point. To this day, the name of the Democratic Party in Minnesota is the Democratic Farm Labor Party. DFL, You'll see it sometimes. And that's the coalition that Brian is building. It's people that are the dispossessed.
Yes, exactly.
And one of his like the thing that was his policy proposal was free silver. Right. So yeah. So I think that those are all very, very good points. And the reason why I brought him up is because in the election
talking about economics again.
Yes, indeed. what would an episode be without it?
Yep.
But in the election of 1896, William McKinley defeats somewhat resoundingly William Jennings Bryan, and he does so largely fueled by a coalition of the Rust Belt states. And I think what we have assumed but not yet fully explicated is the reason why Grover Cleveland not signing Labor Day into law in our time in our non-canonical timeline is that there's a sort of conciliatory nature to the gesture. It kind of takes Grover Cleveland a little bit away from his virulently anti-worker stance, and maybe it assuages some of the most vitriolic elements of the organized labor movement. And as a result, there's less animating force behind that voter bloc. If Grover Cleveland is more obstinate, if Grover Cleveland and George Pullman are in collaboration to suppress this movement, to suppress organized labor, and to do so vigorously and uncompromisingly, McKinley might look a lot less appealing, right? Because McKinley is, despite being from the opposite party, more of the Clevelandian ilk. And Jennings Bryan is more of the anti-Clevelandian ilk. And so if we have a scenario where Grover Cleveland and George Pullman are being obstinate, there may be more animating force pushing them towards William Jennings Bryan. And all it would take is a couple of those Rust Belt states, like, I don't know if Illinois is technically a Rust Belt state, but Illinois, for example, Ohio, Pennsylvania, places like that, only a few of them have to flip for William Jennings Bryan for him to end up winning the Electoral College and the presidency. And I think that it's reasonable to argue that just like in 2016, when James Comey comes out with the October surprise, Grover Cleveland not signing Labor Day as a federal holiday might seem inconsequential, but it might have a ripple effect in precipitating what I've coined as an animating force for the organized labor.
I think just from kind of looking at, the turnout and the election in 1896, I think, just me personally, I think there's maybe a little bit too much of a hill for Bryan to climb to get over the hump and actually win in 96. But what he does do, even in our timeline, is he starts flipping some of those, kind of rural Midwestern states towards his style and brand of, moralistic crusading, and just really getting, even if he doesn't win, even if he's losing these elections, but he is pushing the national conversation towards a certain direction, ultimately impacting, party realignment, and where we see, Teddy Roosevelt coming in as a progressive Republican, after McKinley's assassinated. And it's worth noting that Teddy Roosevelt worked with Grover Cleveland as the minority Senate leader, I believe, in New York early on in his career. So, but I guess what I'm getting at here is that, just kind of doing like some little mental math of whatever, flipping some states here and there. Again, even assuming those entire states are changed from one column to the other. What I think this might possibly do is it can do a couple of things. One of a couple of things. It can either set Bryan up to win in a later election, because in our timeline, he loses in 3 elections, and he becomes most well known for the Scopes monkey trial, which that's going to be interesting to see if that actually still happens as it does in this alternate timeline. But I think that's too far into the weeds. Bryan ends up becoming known for some weird, evolution trial, and loses the election 3 times. Might he win the second go around or the third go around if he is shifting these blocks and these states more towards his side? I don't know. That's a possibility. What I think is more likely is that we end up having some of the issues that he animates and that he really brings to the forefront of the national consciousness. It becomes even a stronger undercurrent. So although McKinley wins, and although, Roosevelt takes over and puts in a lot of progressive changes, there are still issues that are really not addressing the core of the plight of the working class, that Bryan and those Democrats who follow after him really seize that moment. They seize that opportunity. We could see, for example, in the 1912 election, which Chris noted in the pre-podcast, Woodrow Wilson only won and became a name that we know about because the William Howard Taft and Teddy Roosevelt factions of the Republican Party split the vote. I think more likely than Bryan actually winning one of his 3 elections, and he might, but rather than him actually winning one of those outright, I think we might see the Democratic Party win in, let's say, 1912 on its own merits, because labor ends up getting frustrated enough with the slow state of change and the slow state of reforms with the Republicans and with the progressives, to where they're like, okay, Bryan and his ilk and the Democrats have been championing us for a long time. We need to switch. We need to go for them right now. That's where I see this kind of maybe having a downstream impact.
So I think it might happen in 08, and hear me out. But
Okay.
actually 08 or 04, and here's why.
Okay.
Just to kind of throw something else in there. William Jennings Bryan William McKinley is president for the Spanish American War.
Mm-hmm.
William Jennings Bryan, among other things, is virulently opposed to American expansion and colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
In 1904, we're fighting the Philippine insurgency.
Mm.
And I think I'm not getting into the Philippine insurgency. We're not doing that.
As much as we want to.
However,
separate episode.
Long story short, the United States makes promises to Filipino rebels to help us take Manila. We break those promises and wind up fighting a 12-year insurgency against the Philippines to actually take them over. I think this is kind of the point where, because basically between like 1896 and I would say up until 1932, and we played with this in others, there is a progressive bloc that both parties are trying to take over, are trying to get. And it's not clear who's going to win. I think on the Democratic side, you have William Jennings Bryan, who speaks to that population, but then you have Woodrow Wilson, who emphatically does not.
Yeah.
We're not going to get into Wilson either. On the Republican side, you have I'm going to say William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt as the two opposites, because really Taft makes some progressive noises as well. And that is kind of almost that fight between Roosevelt and Taft is almost more a personal battle. So for this long period of time, and we've come back to this period multiple times on this podcast, we still have our Ford, where which side this progressive bloc comes down on is going to be, it's out there. No party owns it yet. And both parties are trying to decide whether it makes more sense for us to make a play for them or to go to, let's call them anti-progressive forces, but there's not really a unified, what does that mean? To the Democrats, that means more traditional Southern landed bourbons. To the Republicans, that means Northern industrialists. So they're two different groups. But so within each party, because at this point, the United States is still almost regionally political parties. Both of those groups are trying to figure out how to incorporate progressivism.
Yeah. I think here's something I can see that can be very interesting is McKinley in 1900, well, actually, let's go to the 1896 election. He has a different vice president than Teddy Roosevelt, because Teddy Roosevelt only becomes vice president because McKinley's original vice president, Garrett Hobart, passes away in office. Hobart, from the little that I could see, seems to be just about as McKinley-esque business establishment Republican as you can possibly get. So Roosevelt, who is more of this progressive ilk, only becomes vice president and then president because of the death of McKinley's original vice president. So we can have a scenario where I'm going to draw a parallel to modern times, for example, where President Trump campaigned on no tax on tips. And Kamala Harris comes along and says, Control V, Control C, Control V, copy paste. I'll do it too. Because she knows that, and at that point, that was a very popular proposal, wants to not lose those votes to Trump to, have no tax on tips. So she promises to do that too. I think this whole, Labor Day thing is just one small issue that, for example, Bryan can campaign on against a more progressive candidate like Roosevelt and say, hey, but he's the one who's leading the discussion on this. He's saying, hey, as president, I promise to be for the downtrodden, for the little guy. And one of those policy proposals is the creation of Labor Day. Roosevelt, by extension, he kind of becomes analogous to Harris in this story. He says, hey, you know what? That's great. I like that too. And he actually believes in it himself too. He's like, yeah, I'll do this. If Roosevelt hasn't in fact already done it himself because he's the president and he can do it and propose it, I digress. We won't get into the particulars on that. But again, this can just be a sign of the times. So it can just be something that is a little issue that ends up becoming indicative of a broader national conversation, a broader shifting of the Overton window towards these labor-centric, worker-centric sorts of issues. And Bryan can easily lampoon Roosevelt for things like foreign adventurism, because Roosevelt has no qualms. He's the, carry a big stick guy. Like, that is his bona fides. And if we are if Bryan is able to successfully tap in to an electorate that is much more concerned about domestic economic issues versus, what Roosevelt is mainly known for is a combination of, popular progressive ideas at home, foreign adventurism abroad. Well, if Bryan comes along and is able to tap into popular discontent against one of those ideas, I could, like what Chris is saying, we could easily see a president, William Jennings Bryan, in 1904.
Yes, I agree with that. And I think one of the things that we that we can chew on to that end about how the parties are going to orient in this scenario where Grover Cleveland vetoes the Labor Day Act is we have to consider that, a bill gets to the president's office not because the president wills it, but because Congress passes it. And if you look at the 1892 Congress, it is a Democrat majority Congress. So to me, it seems like if Congress is going ahead and passing this bill because they want to grant Labor Day, and then Cleveland comes along, friends with Pullman, and decides, I don't want to do this anymore, could that lead to further fomenting against Clevelandism such that the Democratic Party's like, hey, we were willing to do this. We passed this and you vetoed it. We're going to transition to a more pro-labor stance earlier because we understand that there was support for this. And we were willing to pass it, but we had a president who was obstinate in making sure that this did not go through because he was friends with George Pullman, or for whatever reason we want to ascribe to Cleveland for not doing what he did in the OTL.
Labor has a memory.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And throughout other, within certain circles, Democrats today get blamed for things that happened back in the 80s that they were behind, or in the 60s, or all of these things. And I think it's going to be important for the Democrats to keep playing in kind of a progressive sphere to distance themselves from Cleveland and his decision not to. And I think the other thing is, I think they're actually going to look for actual concessions, not a day off. They're going to want, for example, a limit to federal injunctions in strikes. That's the first thing. Or maybe some sort of regulation of private armies, like the Pinkertons, who have literally, after this point, I think it's like 1902 is the Homestead strike, where the most powerful man in the country, J.P. Morgan, owns a steel company, hires the Pinkertons to come in and shoot up striking workers. Even the most libertarian person should revolt at the idea of any private citizen hiring an army.
Exactly. Something I'm thinking about too is, what about things like the 8-hour workday? Like, That I think is something
that would be amazing. I think that's gonna create too many problems.
I think it's
too good.
Yeah, no, I think that's like a, too good to be true sort of scenario. But like, these are the things that might get at least, the conversation gets started earlier and talked about earlier, which ends up possibly leading it to being passed earlier. I don't think it passes now or happens now.
Yeah, I think that's a further down the line, but I agree that it's within the discussion now. It's one of the things that when theoretically William Jennings Bryan sits down with representatives, it's going to be something they talk about. It's going to be something that they ask.
Yes, for sure. So, okay. So we have, as a result of this, possible presidency, of William Jennings Bryan in, we'll say 1904. I think that that's something that if we want to, as we kind of get towards the tail end of this episode here, we could explore some of those implications a little bit. But honestly, this also sets us up for a cool revisit maybe down the line where we talk about in a potential part 2, what a Bryan presidency looks like in 1904. Because as you mentioned, Chris, we have, the Spanish-American War in, 1898, somewhere around that time frame. A lot of this foreign adventurism happening. And so if we take, if we have Roosevelt essentially being not even one full term as a president, and we instead have the Democrats coming back in 1904 versus when they came back in our timeline in 1912, that sets the stage for a very different in the immediate aftermath, because let's assume Bryan serves, 2 terms, he's out in 1912. Does the pendulum swing back to Republicans in 1912? Do Republicans have a hold of the office with, World War I possibly breaking out when it does? The 1920s are, kind of significantly different as a result, roaring 20s. But I think all of those put together are much too big of issues we're biting off more than we can chew here in the last few minutes of the episode. I think just one thing I also wanted to mention as well before we get into any, possible discussion of Bryan is I think that while, some individual actors like Debs might end up becoming, and staying more in the labor union route, I do think that, and a big part of why Cleveland did this was because he wanted the more moderate labor voices to be elevated. He might not himself have been super in favor of them, but in this instance, it's the enemy is my friend. If you are opposed to guys like the May Day sort of, way more radical types, okay, I'm fine with maybe elevating your position a little bit for the purpose of not having the May Day people be more successful. I think that we could see more of the animation, maybe not from Debs in particular, but from other possible more radical voices. Those kind of get brought up and elevated a little bit more in the national consciousness, which to me has very interesting downstream effects on things like the Red Scare. Do we have a stronger, counter reaction to this rise in more radical elements? Or do we have such a degree of sympathy for, labor and workers' rights to where we see an even further shifting of the Overton window because those radical elements are given more credence? Those are issues that, again, I also think are a little bit too big to bite off more than we can chew here at the end. But those are just some questions that we can think about as well, and maybe take a stab at as well when I stop soapboxing.
I think Debs always stays out as one of the more radical people in American politics.
Yeah.
He kind of coalesces a lot of the activist political unions around him. Not to introduce somebody at the very end, but I'm going to introduce somebody at the very end, Samuel Gompers.
Yes.
President of the AFL.
Yeah.
And he is the kind of labor leader who shows up to a meeting in a nice suit. He is the leader that would want to sit down with a Bryan and get actual concessions. He is focused on actually improving working conditions versus kind of a nebulous improving working people. Gompers is more, I want an 8-hour day for my people. I want this for my people. And I think both wings of American labor are going to be activated by this. The radical wing is going to say, we got nothing. That means we need to get into politics on our own.
Fight harder. Yeah.
Yeah.
The
absolutely
more moderate, more contractual trade unionist side of this, I think, can take advantage of how scared now both main parties are and show up at the table and win, and actually win some significant concessions.
Yeah. And we can also talk very briefly about like these sham company run unions. I forget what they're exactly called, but that was sort of the one of the things that was a big issue in this whole Pullman strike thing to begin with was they had unions, and there were these company run unions. I forget there's a specific name for them that I'm forgetting, but they're these company run unions, which are basically sham unions, but they're given to the workers in order to placate them. If we have this disposition of obstinacy against organized labor, do they even try? Do they continue trying, or do they just say, screw you guys, we're just gonna bulldoze you even harder?
That's not even worth the effort of coming up.
Not even worth the effort.
It
was a show trial it was a complete show pageant to begin with. Why even waste the money on that? So I think that's a very interesting thing that probably would look differently. Another thing, and this is going to be a big bomb, and I don't want to fully get into this, but just to think about it, plant the seed, is civil rights. Okay. A lot of the initiation of the civil rights movement was fomented on the Pullman cabs, on the Pullman cars. The original strike, the Pullman strike that we are talking about, was primarily of white workers, exclusively of white workers, pretty much. But there was a large contingency, which I mentioned all the way at the beginning of the episode and never again, which was the Pullman porters were largely African-American men who serviced those trains. And initially, they were not included in the strike for racially motivated reasons. However, when they saw that there were consistent, slow, but nevertheless persistent concessions being made, one of which was Labor Day, and then more to come, the Pullman porters basically decided, hey, maybe it's our turn to start to fight for some of these things. The white workers are getting slow progress, but progress nonetheless. Maybe we should start doing this. If in our timeline, or if in our timeline, I always get confused about which one's which.
Our timeline, alternate timeline.
Alternate timeline. Thank you. Yeah. If in the alternate timeline, there is no initial concession with Labor Day, and maybe, that leads to the civil rights movement being delayed, or if organized labor fights harder, it ends up leading to civil rights starting earlier.
I think it animates it sooner, and here's why.
Yeah, I think that's
the Republicans. The Republican Party is the party of Lincoln, and wins anywhere between 80 to 90% of the African American vote for decades.
And what changes it? What changes it is in 1932, when what we were talking about earlier, this progressive bloc goes Democrat.
Yep. I think a big part of why Bryan might end up winning the election is he gets just enough of these, loyal but disaffected, African-American voters and workers who are seeing that he's sticking up for their causes, which is, kind of ironic when you think of it and who Bryan is and, his main supportive base of support. But I digress. If they see him as championing their cause, then it might not be necessarily as dramatic as the change that we see in the African-American voting patterns from 1860 to 1932, and then they flipped. But it would be a more gradual, but I think even more impactful change, seeing this voting bloc suddenly start becoming 70% Republican, 60, 55%, and then it ends up becoming 80 to 90% Democrat. That persists almost until this day. So yeah, just seeing the downstream effects of that too is really fascinating.
Yeah.
All right, gentlemen.
Such a small change, but nevertheless,
such a small change. And initially, when in my debate with Kai at the before this episode, I'm like, I don't think it's going to necessarily be this issue alone that has the massive changes. But sometimes when you do change one little thing, one little gear in the machinery of the machine of history, it does in fact actually have big downstream effects that extend far beyond that little particular issue itself. Any other last minute things that you guys want to bring up before we bring this to a close?
Not that I could think of, not without dropping any more
unnecessarily
episode lengthening
threatening
bombs.
It, but I think this might be a good two-part. We might want to come back to this.
We might want to.
A lot of our episodes.
Yeah, we do this at a lot of our episodes, but
we threaten to do it.
We threaten to. Do we actually do it? Rarely do we do.
Well,
so,
I think it might be better to, instead of doing a part 2 of this episode, to take a fork from this episode, such as a Bryan presidency, and just work with that. Not necessarily make it a sequel, but make it an offshoot of what we discussed.
Okay, yeah, and it could be kind of like maybe something that we acknowledge in that episode, but it's not necessarily okay. We're continuing the timeline from when Labor Day was not passed by Grover Cleveland. Yeah, we can take.
We need a fresh assumption. We need a fresh assumption to rejuvenate and stimulate more conversation.
Yeah,
but I think
I like
working from this premise with a new fork is very cool and a fun episode
for sure. Absolutely. One last thing I'm just going to throw in at the very end is, during preparation for this episode, I've been reading a book by a former guest host of ours. Shout out to Bo Breslin. I don't know if you still listen to this podcast. Would love to hear from you if you still do. But he wrote a book called A Constitution for the Living, and I won't belabor this point too much, but it's essentially a book that talks about different constitutional conventions if the United States adopted a Thomas Jeffersonian ideal, which was we edit the Constitution every generation. So I just so happened to read the 1903 chapter before this episode aired or was recorded. And that actually mentions the Pullman strike. It mentions a lot of the laws and, things that were passed and issues that animated the national conversation during this time. And a name that was brought up as an ally of Booker T. Washington was a man named John Brown Lennon. And this is not some sort of weird fusion between John Brown and the Beatles singer John Lennon. But he is, John Brown Lennon is the secretary of a union called the Journeyman Tailors Union. And I think it stands to reason that someone like him, a more moderate voice, is maybe given more of a platform in this alternate timeline that we have constructed for ourselves, because he might be someone that could be an advisor, a negotiator at the table under a Bryan administration. If not, maybe even possibly a Secretary of Labor. And if it's not him, it could be somebody like him. But all of that is to say that I thoroughly recommend that book. It's been a great book so far. I have not been paid to put this spot in, but I'll just say it's been an entertaining book, and it's made me think about a lot of issues surrounding not just this fork, but other possible forks in American history as well. All right, gentlemen. Well, thanks for joining me in these very interesting speculations, and thank you, dear audience, for listening along. Feel free always to hop on the Discord and let us know how right we are, how wrong we are. We've been getting some Spotify comments too, some interesting discussion there. And as we always like to end off these episodes, if we happen to encounter a fork in time, what, pray tell, do you think we should do with that?
Lead it.
Hold up. Let's back up. Take it. Thank you so much for listening, everyone.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.